Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Jackson Crawford. On my channel I mostly talk about Old Norse language, myth, runes, etc. But I also deal with some related languages. And one language that I have started to do a little bit of work trying to introduce people to is Gothic. And Gothic is the first Germanic language that is the languages in the subgroup of Indo-European that include English, German, Old Norse, etc. that is attested abundantly. Now we do have Proto-Norse, or really even Proto-Germanic, written in runes in Scandinavia and in Germany a little bit, and Eastern Europe a little bit, going back to at least AD 150, but runic inscriptions tend to be really short. With Gothic we have a Bible translation by Wulfila from the 300s, and even though the entire translation hasn't survived, enough of it, especially enough of the New Testament has, that we have much more Gothic than of any other Germanic language until about the 800s AD, when we get some more Old Saxon, Old English, Old High German. Now, I thought that I would do a video with another little sample of Gothic for you so you could kind of hear the language, get a feel for it. And I was going to take a little bit from Wulfila's Bible translation, but you know, it's a little bit, it doesn't really give you a sense of Gothic per se, in the sense that, you know, you can read the Bible in any language. But I dug around a little bit and I found a fairly recently discovered fragment of Gothic that's a little bit more interesting. It's also religious in context, but a little bit more unique. This is a sample of Gothic graffiti dating to the late 800s, so much later than most of the Gothic that we have in the form of Wulfila's Bible translation. This was found on stone debris excavated by Russian archaeologist Maria Tichanova. I hope I'm pronouncing that close to correct, at Mangu in Crimea, not far from Sevastopol. The stone debris in question has Greek graffiti as well, and that was recognized early on, but it wasn't until Maxim Karabov and Andrei Vinogradov examined the fragments in the 2010s at a museum in Bakhchisarai, Crimea, that the Gothic inscriptions were identified and interpreted. So here is the longest one of those Gothic inscriptions from Mangu. It goes like this, and I'm going to give you two different Gothic pronunciations. One assumes that the old Germanic diphthongs and short vowels that Wulfila wrote the same were pronounced the same, and then one assumes that the diphthongs were still diphthongs like they were in, say, Proto-Norse or Old High German, but just written the same because of the Greek orthography that Wulfila was imitating. So here we go with the, I'll do the pronunciation that collapses the diphthongs and monophthongs. Huasguth mikils sweguth unsar, thu esguth workjan sildalika, anustod und ahwins ustautham, ja in midjun garda. If we don't collapse the diphthongs together, we get something more like Huasguth mikil sweguth unsar, thu isguth workjan sildalika, ein ustod und eiwens ustautham, ja in midjun garda. So this is, the first little bit of it is based on Psalm 77:13, who is so great a God as our God. So, what a great God as our God. Probably this is a question, what God is as great as our God? You are a God working wondrous things is the neuter accusative plural of an adjective syllolex, meaning wonderful. Alone, God, I guess this isn't stated, the subject, stood up through all time out from among the dead. This is another adjective being used nominally, Doutham, in the dative, and in Midgarth. Now the inscription just says Mithun, but it's very likely that this would have been followed by Garth in the accusative, or Gartha in the dative, as Karabath, and Vinagradaf point out. It could be followed by dative or accusative in Gothic. Wolfila translates Ukumene, right, the world, with Mithungards, Midgard, the same as the Old Norse expression for the realm that humans live in, right, the middle enclosure, the world enclosed by high peaks, perhaps like these behind me in grizzly country in Wyoming, that separate human beings from the surrounding realms where the Jotnar, or giants, or as I translated them in the Corsair Quarter for the Great Courses, anti-gods live. A couple other things to point out. Note that God is abbreviated to G Thorn, or the Gothic alphabet equivalents. That's actually quite a common custom in Gothic. It's interesting. It's continued 500 years after Wolfila, because we see it, for example, in the Codex Argenteus, one of the most famous manuscripts of the Gothic Bible. God abbreviated just G Thorn. It's interesting to see just how little this language seems to be changed from Wolfila's Gothic 500 years earlier. We know from a few different sources that Gothic was still spoken in the Crimea, the very region where this was found, into probably the 1600s AD, although we have very little documentation of that other than one Flemish traveler's account. It's interesting that perhaps this doesn't reflect so much that the spoken language remained so similar to Wolfila's over 500 years, but rather that there was still enough, perhaps ecclesiastical use of Wolfila's Gothic Bible translation that language remained in use for formal occasions, much like King James English remains in use by some communities of Christians and pagans today, even though that's not obviously how anybody normally naturally talks. One other thing I'd point out is with the number 1 or alone in Ein Ustod and Iwins, 1 stood up through all time, stood out, arose through all time. We'd expect eins in Gothic, a little bit more like the German perhaps. This may reflect a sound change a little bit like in Old Norse. We have some assimilation of that final S or Z to an N. But it's hard to tell if that's actually a sound change that's occurred here or just something that the inscriber might not have put in. As to this question of whether the monophthongs and diphthongs were pronounced the same, I've gone back and forth about it a bit. Wolfila, and to the extent that there are other Gothic writers, are so consistent about it that it's tempting to think that the diphthongs had collapsed into monophthongs. But given that the AI and AU do reflect pretty well what those Germanic diphthongs ought to have been, it's really tempting to see that as the old Germanic diphthongs that would give rise to, for example, EI, AU, and Old Norse. Of course, Gothic is not Proto-Germanic. It is the most like Proto-Germanic of any of the well-attested Germanic languages. I mean, arguably our earliest Germanic inscriptions and runes are in Proto-Germanic. But we have to remember that, kind of like how people sometimes want to take Icelandic as if it represents Old Norse 1,000 years ago, Gothic also, while similar to Proto-Germanic in some important respects, like not having umlaut, or all the other assimilatory phenomena of later Germanic languages, is not the language from which all of the other Germanic languages descend. It has undergone its own unique sound changes too, like Icelandic has today. So it's very valuable for understanding early Germanic languages, but it doesn't represent exactly their ancestor. And we need to resist the temptation to think of it that way, even while appreciating its great value to comparative historical Germanic linguistics. All right. Well, I hope that was a somewhat interesting display of Gothic and announcement for those interested in this recent-ish find. I was surprised to find out about it, and I'm glad that I did. Well, thank you, Patreon, for your continued support of my channel. It's what pays the bills. And to everyone out there from the beaches of Wyoming, I'm wishing you all the best.